This video is sponsored by Squarespace.
Why are you white? Oh my god, Karen, you can't just ask people why they're white.
Howdy folks, this is Fiona Apollo. You may know me from videos such as Girl Complains About Adult Cartoons. Maybe we shouldn't glamorize this. And why do I need to make a video telling you to act like normal humans? But aside from those various exploits, I'm also an animator and story buff who likes to analyze the behaviors, origins, and psychological processes of various characters in fiction, and the infinite multitude of factors at play that go into this. And something I tend to come across without fail is the million-dollar question. Should someone who is a part of a certain group portray a character who is a member of another group? Personally, I think it's never a bad thing to broaden your horizons, but you always end up with a bit of a debate around this because it really does open up a Pandora's box of scenarios. Should a straight person who doesn't engage much with queer spaces depict a gay character who immerses themselves in said spaces in their material? Should someone who is creating a story that has a clear moral stance between good and evil have a sympathetic villain? Can a white person living in Bulgaria fairly and accurately depict the lives and struggles of a black family living in Texas? Should someone who has never experienced a certain degree of harm caused by another individual write about a character with a troubled home life or relationship and have that be a large focus of their story? It can be a very daunting endeavour, understanding the who, what, how, and whys in which certain characters and experiences should be expressed and in what ways. And while I'm certainly not an expert, it is something I've been working towards for a very long time with the perspective and understanding that there are a great many reasons this might happen. From honouring an old friend's memory to a fascination with a certain movement or time period, it can honestly be anything. I have also noticed recently that there appears to be a bit of hesitance towards doing this, likely due to a lot of world tensions currently, so it's worth knowing that including certain characters isn't going to blow up in your face like the internet might have you believe. However, that's not to say that there aren't issues or risks that also accompany that, and while it's a nice thought to believe that this is always going to be done in good faith, if that was the case then we wouldn't have things like caricatures and stereotypes now, would we? So I thought today, after a heavy topic last time, while this is something that could very much spiral into a very weighty history lesson, I would like to come at this from the perspective of someone who is creating a story which contains a diverse cast and go through my motivations as to why I made up my characters the way they are, in addition to a couple of existing examples in media too. Because, I'll be honest, the world is becoming scarily divisive in how all manner of people view each other right now, and I feel like it's important to maintain the idea that depicting various characters is not something you should shy away from, nor is it something that you should fear backlash about. A lot of this video might seem like a mouthful for a simple concept. If you want to create a character that isn't like you, just do it. It's actually really easy. But even with that, I know some people are wary of it, so I hope this helps to ease you into feeling a little bit less so. These, of course, are my own thoughts on the subject, and my thoughts are very limited. Trust me, I've had COVID 3 times, but I hope it goes some of the way towards giving people an understanding of how this can be both a benefit and a potential detriment. So if you enjoy what you're hearing, then please stick around and consider liking and subscribing. It helps me out a lot. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. Well, I gotta say, if there is one thing that anyone of any creative culture or background can benefit from, it is a dang good website. And where else could possibly be a better hub of operations than today's sponsor, Squarespace? Squarespace is an all-in-one website-making powerhouse for all your portfolio, business, or general nerdy needs. There is quite literally any type of website that can be crafted for any type of person. You like jazz? Why not choose from a plethora of templates to make a website all to do with your favorite jazz musicians? No? Not jazz? That's fine, I guess, but if pre-made templates aren't your thing either, it's a good thing Squarespace allows you to create your own website from scratch too, and even cater that to your exact specifications using design intelligence. I, for one, have been working on a website that contains a page for my Mint and Friends series, for which I am happy to announce that the website is now live! Woohoo! Woohoo! Good job, me. With an almost unmatched suite of visual design effects, built in and ready to go on any website, you will be able to readily engage visitors and urge them to come back again and again. And if you're willing to turn some of that aesthetic draw into a branding or business move, Squarespace has you covered there too. Why not create a full-blown online store? Showcase your products and customize your listings with all the best images, videos, reviews, add-ons, bells and whistles that you could possibly need. And thanks to Squarespace's commerce platform, you'll be able to manage everything from inventory to sales to customers, easy peasy lemon wheezy. I really need to remember to breathe while I talk. If that sounds like your kind of scene, then head over to squarespace.com for a free trial, and don't forget to go to squarespace.com/fionapollo to save 10% off of your first purchase of a website or a domain. Now why don't you go make that jazz website, Still not a fan of jazz? Oh, don't worry. You will be. You will be. Just a fair warning, this section ended up being kind of a sitcom info dump, mostly because me and my partner love sitcoms, but also because they're a pretty significant cultural touchstone for understanding the social dynamics of the time they're created in. But just stay with me, okay? I have a point with all of this, I promise. So we've all seen that there is a push to be as inclusionary as we can be in the things we do and the things we create. And I personally agree with that sentiment very much because, well, I like having lots of different types of people around, and I also like to be nosy and listen to other people talk about their lives. And having lots of different lives to listen to is both interesting and educational in my humble and sheltered Northern English opinion. But something I see that is often very debated with this topic is, why is this so important? Do we really need to be so inclusive in every piece of media we create and consume, even if it's not directed at certain types of people, yada 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 yada? And the answer to that, in my opinion, depends mostly on context. It can in fact be a yes or a no, and sometimes a maybe. And this context will be different for everyone depending on what you want out of your chosen media and whether what you want actually clashes with these perceived sensibilities. But for me personally, I try to always ask myself these three things. What are your goals for the kind of story you want to tell? Does the current cast feel like a good fit for the types of scenarios you are hoping to lay out? And does changing any defining factors of these characters make a difference in terms of the narrative's end goal? Now, I obviously can't give a blanket statement here, but I will, however, use the sitcom Friends as an example that I see people often bring up, and also because my Patreon Discord mentioned Friends a short while ago, and it brought back a bunch of memories of me watching it with my sister. Friends follows the story of 6 people who live in Manhattan, with a focus on their interpersonal struggles with work, love, living situations, and everything in between. And a common critique of the show is that for a story set in New York, which is a famously diverse melting pot of a city filled with people from all walks of life, despite this, all 6 of the main cast are white. Now, I'm just going to say that a lot of that is down to who is in charge of the sitcom's production and the executives, and this may surprise you, but pretty much all of them were white as well. Even though the 90s went leaps and bounds in terms of more diverse stories being told, there were an equal number of people at the top who made all the decisions who still had yet to be convinced. In fact, David Schwimmer, who played Ross, actively fought to have more inclusion within the show, hence why some of Ross's ex-partners throughout the series were not only non-white, but also non-heterosexual, including Charlie, played by Alsha Tyler, Julie, played by Lauren Tom, and Carol, played by Jane Sibbett. With that in mind, going back to our 3 initial questions, the goal of Friends is simple. It's a show about 6 friends living in Manhattan, and shockingly, those 6 friends could take any form, including being all white. By today's standards, that isn't amazing to many viewers who are not that, but objectively speaking, for the sake of the story, their race doesn't really play all that much into the overall plot. And as far as scenarios go, while having some more inclusion could make the scenarios of some of the episodes more nuanced, the ones we have in the show were still pretty universal. Also, especially back 20-30 years ago and beyond, certain groups did in fact stay within their allotted communities and didn't mingle as much as they do today, which is of course another thing to consider. Friends isn't like Brooklyn Nine-Nine, which focuses on the inner workings of a police precinct in New York that can offer plenty of chances to comment on how different types of people are treated by the authorities, including those who work there. It's also not like Modern Family, where we get to see the ways in which several non-traditional families function, such as Jay and Gloria, who have a noticeable age difference and of whom Gloria is also Colombian, or even Cameron and Mitchell, who are a same-sex couple who adopt a daughter. Friends' core concept lay within the universal experience of your friend group always having something going on and either having it be relayed back to you or occasionally being roped in. That reason, in addition to everything else that came afterwards, is what contributed to the show's massive success at the time. Finally, would changing any defining factors of these characters make a difference in terms of the narrative's end goal? Well, again, yes or no, because this sitcom is to do with the group's persisting friendships, which includes all of their ridiculous dramas, romantic endeavors, job prospects, etc. It would honestly depend on what exactly you're choosing to change. That said, even if a certain aspect being changed didn't affect the way the show progresses and ends, what it would influence is the ways in which the goals of the narrative would be reached, and more importantly, the viewer's reception to it. Because as much as we love to believe that the aspects of a character could exist within the narrative and leave it at that, these things are often pulled from reality, and reality will often dictate them in turn. For example, let's take my fave of the bunch, Joey. I love Joey. His actor not so much, but the character had this goofy but lovable charm to him.
How you doing?
Joey is the only character of the main 6 who remains single at the end. Ignoring the atrocious spin-off series that focused on him, the one consistent thing with Joey was that he had the most luck with landing dates out of the group, but never married or settled down due to a fear of commitment. I'm gonna be honest and say that I 100% think Joey should have been bisexual, and having an episode with him come to terms with that and potentially dating a guy but ultimately not staying together, same as all his other flings, would have been a good thing to see, because it wouldn't have drastically altered his character in any way. He would have still been the charming, struggling actor we we all know, and it still lines up with its endgame of being single at the end of the series. Sadly, at that time, there was not a snowball in hell's chance of Joey becoming bisexual in the original series because we had a little-known epidemic going on in the 90s called the AIDS crisis. This unfortunately also led to a lot of humor within the show to have aged like milk. Oh my god, it was so bad. I didn't realize how bad it was until I came across a very lengthy video of all the homophobic jokes in the show. A lot of people also remarked on this, as well as the lack of diversity when the show finally got uploaded to Netflix as well. There was also this whole thing with Monica being fat when she was younger, and the show put Courtney Cox, a very thin woman in a fat suit, and constantly slung fat jokes and insults at her. It was honestly pretty vile. The romanticization of the 90s is crazy when you look back at what was actually going on at that time. While Carol could mostly get away with being portrayed as a lesbian at the time as a side character, in addition to the fact that AIDS didn't affect queer women nearly to the same degree, the same couldn't be said for queer men, and having a queer main cast member just wouldn't have been possible without an entire slew of vitriol being levied at Joey's actor. It also doesn't help that Matt LeBlanc himself disagrees with the notion that the show was homophobic in any sense, despite there being some very clear off-color jokes, especially towards characters like Chandler's gender-ambiguous parent Charles, aka Helena Handbasket, which is a fantastic name, who is a drag performer in Las Vegas, uses he/him pronouns, wears feminine clothing both on and off the stage, and is played by Kathleen Turner, a cis woman. But I digress. I think the topic of Friends is ultimately an interesting one, not only because the show works as a kind of time capsule of the 90s, but because its resurgence really puts into perspective the kinds of depictions and sensibilities people now prioritize in more modern media. Not just for other people, but for themselves, to the point where looking back and seeing what things used to be like is actually quite jarring. It's become quite common for representation in media to be seen as a type of virtue, which I personally don't know how to feel about, because while I think inclusion is typically a good thing, it can also run the risk of such inclusion ringing quite hollow depending on how it's approached. Some argue that the inclusion of characters like Carol and Helena in Friends opened the doors for many of these types of characters, and it likely did, but that's also not to say that people can't be upset at it looking back, because these feelings aren't actually all that new. People were upset with it on the day those episodes originally aired, but I guess it's all up to interpretation. That's what this whole video is about. But anyway, I know I went on a whole tirade about Friends there, so let's move on. So, as mentioned, there are a whole plethora of ways you can go about this concept. You don't have to be of a certain group to portray someone within it, but there are also some things you may well need to consider and be aware of. Firstly, let's look at a specific scenario. Say you want to write about a character who is involved in an industry where people from all walks of life come to make a living and pursue their dreams of becoming a creative and doing things on their own terms. That's pretty much the basis of my story, Mint and Friends, and for the most part, that premise is based off of my own personal endeavors of trying to break into the animation industry and then eventually trying out YouTube. Two places where you are going to come across all sorts of people with varying backgrounds, skills, and ambitions. So, going back to our three questions, what are the goals for the kind of story you want to tell? Well, I come from a very boring and dull town that doesn't have a lot going for it and decided that I wanted to leave for greener pastures. I became very taken with the idea of being able to visit places that were lively and full of people from all over who I couldn't predict the lived experiences of, and that had thriving businesses which allowed people the kinds of opportunities they craved in order to lead a fulfilling life, which is something that if I'd stayed in my hometown would have been just completely unthinkable. And guess what? That is a kind of premise that anyone could potentially relate to. Times are tough, and it's easy to romanticize being able to just up and leave towards somewhere more exciting. That's the whole reason we have so many stories of people moving to LA or New York or Paris or Greece or wherever just to have the chance to reinvent themselves. Of course, depending on what is prioritized within said premise will also obviously dictate just how achievable this kind of scenario may be, as of course different types of people will have different types of goals. If, for example, you were creating a story about someone who had a dream of becoming a ballerina, this would impact their physical appearance and in-universe habits such as healthy eating and regular exercise. But even then, the important thing for a lot of these characteristics is the humanistic facets that go alongside them. Everyone knows that these are common traits for a ballerina and that becoming a ballerina is really, really tough. But you can also choose to focus on someone who struggles with this through means such as, I don't know, possibly not being able to afford those healthy greens she needs, or being too tired to do all of her exercises due to other commitments like a job outside of her craft. Or maybe even having some kind of disadvantage or disability to work through. A good example of that one is actually Luz from the Owl House, who has to work around being a human and rely on learning about sigils in order to learn how to do magic on the Boiling Isles.
I want to be a witch.
Having characters who have to rebel against a predetermined or preconceived nature of who they are, what they do, or where they come from is also a pretty interesting angle, as it can give people grounds to explore those situations that have somewhat of a base in reality, while still being able to allow themselves the ability to explore other possibilities for these characters. Something that always seems to become prevalent in my works, which I've been realizing a lot more lately, is that a decent bunch of my characters either play instruments or play in bands, because, well, I have a musical family myself, and music can often be one of the easiest avenues towards cross-cultural understanding, in my opinion. It's also, however, a medium that can often be steeped in stereotypes, propaganda, and misconceptions of who exactly can be allowed to create or listen to various genres. And this can unfortunately bleed into how the people who listen to or perform these genres are viewed. Alternative genres, for example, are often seen as like emo white kid music, and I've often heard from non-white people online that their parents don't like them listening to it because of its often angry-sounding tone that supposedly promotes things like violence and satanic worship. But in reality, a lot of the more celebrated bands in alt music speak out against various forms of injustice and advocate for sticking up for oneself in their music. It's often documented as well that people who listen to emotionally charged music use it as an outlet for their frustrations, and as a result, tend to be a lot more emotionally balanced overall. For that reason, I've actually noticed an increasingly common trend of non-white characters in fiction donning the alternative label, and even I've done it with my own characters Sorbet, Cherry, and Licorice, who are all in a punk band together. But this trend actually has more historical roots than you might think. Again, looking at our second question, does the current cast feel like a good fit for the types of scenarios you are hoping to lay out? The angle I took with Sorbet and Licorice in particular is that they are two siblings that come from a family of musicians, and who are trying to pave their own ways in their respective fields. Licorice is the more conventional of the two, opting to record and release his own rock album, while Sorbet, despite being a reputable drummer and songwriter, is trying to break away from that association and become a novelist. And the reason I went with this is because I know a decent amount about Northern Soul, which was a dance movement in the north of England during the 1960s and 70s that celebrated Black American soul music. This movement went on to inspire a deep-rooted music scene within the north that is still very much alive today, and I've always found that fact to be really fascinating. To think that these people who lived so far away and who you didn't see many of in this specific location during that time period could have such a large impact on my local area's culture, why wouldn't I want to honour that by having characters who reflect that aspect of music history within my own works? And that's often something that can also be overlooked when we think about whether a certain type of character fits within a story, because it could have absolutely nothing to do with accuracy or depicting real life or anything like that, and everything to do with either appreciation or a bit of good old shameless self-indulgence. There are a good many ways you can learn to apply these various concepts without having to think too hard about the characters themselves, because a lot of them are pretty universal and not nearly as tricky to portray, so long as you're able to justify it to yourself, I guess. I personally wanted to look at the duality of this in terms of familial expectations, one child following in his family's footsteps and carrying on their legacy, and the other trying to carve out her own. And that in itself can speak to the duality of having siblings, which is a far more broad experience for many of us. These characters also being black just happen to also stem from an appreciation towards the original black soul musicians who kickstarted a movement that was prevalent in the area I live in. So finally, does changing any defining factors of these characters make a difference in terms of the narrative's end goal? If such traits are an integral part of your character's identity, then even if it can be altered while maintaining the end goal of the narrative, the thing you'll probably want to ask is whether you actually want to commit to that. And if so, in what manner? Because let's be honest, if that character being depicted in a certain way was even on the cards to begin with, you're probably going to want to give it a long hard think as to whether it is something you want to change, but if it is, then that's fine. Surprise! It's your story, you can do whatever you want. While trying to appeal to an audience as well can also seem appealing, if it doesn't appeal to you first, you're not going to be all that passionate about it and people will be able to tell. Rule of thumb, prioritize the vision, then think about audience expectations if you must. But if the reason you're changing it is due to a lack of confidence in depicting a certain racial group or orientation or disability, even if you do have the desire to, then there are in fact some things you can do to help with that. Do your research. While it may be nice to decide to create a character of a certain background for your story, it is equally important to understand why you as an individual want to do that. Are you doing it because you want a diverse cast of characters? Yes? Okay, so then why is that important to you personally? Think carefully about your answer to that, because while it is nice that you want to be inclusive, you still need to know at least a bit about what you're getting into. Whatever type of character you are trying to create, listen to people within the same group, primarily fellow storytellers and artists who focus on depicting such characters relating to their own communities. Look at how they portray themselves and what goes into it, and try to do that with the understanding of the motivations behind it. Why were certain choices made, and why were certain things emphasized? Also, put yourself in the character's shoes. I know that one's pretty obvious, but an issue I find with a lot of people trying to create different types of characters is that if they are writing a situation involving, like, a queer character, for example, they often think to themselves, what would a queer character do, and not, what would I do if I was queer? That's a very important distinction, and if your answer to that is, well, I'm not queer, therefore I shouldn't have to ask that question, you probably shouldn't be utilizing those types of characters. Lastly, I know all of this sounds like there are a bunch of rules and things to consider, but it also isn't as serious or scary as you might have been led to believe. As a society, we focus a lot on accuracy in the pursuit of sensitivity and understanding, but the creative sphere is somewhere accuracy cannot always curate or control in regards to what we're seeing, and sometimes a piece of work is intended to have the opposite effect sometimes. These depictions are only as grandiose or serious as you make them. Stories and characters and all of that aren't supposed to stress you out, and if they genuinely are, you don't have to include them. I think people would appreciate it more if you were honest about that. Regardless, we're all here to enjoy creating, and that's the most important thing about it all. The stories we make are often idealizations of things we place importance on. You're the master of your own universe, okay? So do with that what you will. Anyway, I think that's a wrap from me, folks. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. As per the usual, thank you, as always, to my fantastic patrons. Thank you to my YouTube peeps, Jesse Sparks, Manuel Lexon Gonzalez, Ash Valentine, Lauren R, Mystic Mind, Pedanticat, Ed Boy, and Hero Sky Arts. And an extra special thank you to my indie production supporters, Morgan LaFay Thin, Matty A, Kiyoshi, and Round Cat. If you'd like to become a patron, a link to my page will be down below. Please stay safe, everyone out there, and I will speak to you all very soon. Happy character creation. Bye! Da, 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 da. Thank you for that, Olive. I can't remember the tune. Bye.